welcome to this diversion from that small detail that's happening across the Atlantic. Maybe we'll keep your minds off that for an hour and a half here. So welcome this afternoon to our side event on climate change, equity and the Paris Agreement. My name's Allison Doig. I'm from Christian Aid it's a UK development NGO. I've been sort of in the background a lot of the equity work for a number of years, and been familiar, but maybe not at the forefront of it as our speakers are now. So we do have 5 panelists, and I think there'll be a good flow between the different panelists of the different topics to do with equity. I think before Paris, we had equity was seen as binary. We had developed and developing, Annex 1, non-Annex 1, however you wanted to do it. In the post-Paris world, we've got a much more of a spectrum. It actually, in many ways, makes equity much more critical. How do we differentiate between different countries? How do we interpret CBDR, which is still an active discussion in these negotiations this week? How do we interpret that in the I think the panel is going to enlighten on us with us today. So I think I'll move on quickly too. We've got 5 to go through, but as I say, I think the flow will be good. We've got Anju Sharma is going to give us a scene set of why is it still important? Why is equity as an issue still important as we go into the post-Paris world? She's director of the Oxford Climate Policy and head of policy analysis and publications of the European Capacity Building Initiative. She's a visiting fellow at IIED and associate of SEI, so she's involved with all these critical organisations, and in the past has worked with UNEP, Oxfam, GB, and the Centre for Science and Environment in New Delhi. So, Anju.
Yeah, so, I mean, I've been coming to these negotiations far longer than I care to admit. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. So what I thought I would do is to basically start the discussion by talking about a little bit about the history of equity in the negotiations and the knots that we've tied ourselves into in trying to avoid this problem face on. So as some of you will know, that right from the beginning in 88, 89, when we started trying to deal with the climate change problem globally, we had the US on the one hand, who wanted pretty much national strategies. And you had the EU trying to play an in-between role. And what they talked about in those days was pledge and review, which is pretty much where we've arrived at now after all these years, the nationally determined contributions. But even then, comparisons were being made between national emissions, but except that they were aggregate. And it was at that point that developing countries led by India had made the point that there was actually a difference between the survival emissions, per capita emissions of the poor in the south and the luxury emissions of the rich in the north. So they pushed to say that there had to be a recognition of historical responsibility, of current emission levels, etc. And they wanted a convention or a global treaty that was based firmly in the polluter pays principle. But what they got instead was this common but differentiated responsibilities principle, which they saw at that time as a diluted version of the polluter pays principle. Now, when the convention was agreed in 1992, it didn't include any legally binding cuts. And this was not acceptable to the one group of countries that's consistently been pushing for effectiveness, which is namely the small island states, because they have a lot to lose. So the small island states continued to push after the convention was adopted for the Toronto targets to be adopted, which I think were basically 20% cuts based on 1988 levels or something by 2005, I think it was. But in any case, what they wanted was legally binding cuts. And so when countries met at the first COP in Berlin, AOSIS put forward this proposal. Countries like India at that point, their first reaction was to oppose it. They didn't want legally binding cuts. But then you had Indian NGOs that worked on the Indian delegation, and they managed to convince them to support the AOSIS proposal. Now, the reason I mention this is because a very similar thing happened in Paris, all those many years later, when India came out as opposing the 1.5-degree target. Basically, what it is that countries are afraid of ambition when they don't know what criteria on which what the criteria is on which they will be expected to take action. So in Berlin, the German media had a very critical role to play as well. They convinced Angela Merkel, who was then environment minister. And as a result, the Berlin Mandate was agreed. And one of the key elements of it was that it said there would be no commitments for developing countries at that point. Now, unfortunately, developing countries took this as a signal to more or less sit back and let Annex 1 sort it out amongst themselves. So the negotiations to the Kyoto Protocol were a fight between the EU and the US. And this was to some extent a mistake. I mean, what we were telling them at that point is that you have to engage. So what we were trying to convince, I worked at that point with the Center for Science and Environment, and we were trying to tell the Indian government at that point that you have to engage now and make sure that whatever rules apply to the rich countries can also apply to us in the future. So there has to be a sensible way, for instance, in which countries, it's decided that countries will have to take on targets and how much emissions reductions they'd have to be. So there has to be some fair basis. And in fact, there were some pretty good proposals on the table then. For instance, you had the Brazilian proposal, which was about deciding responsibility on the basis of contributions to temperature increase. And this was discussed for many years later in the SPI. But at that point, developing countries were not, I think, not strong enough, not coordinated enough to push that through. Now, developing countries may not have been at the table, but they were definitely on the menu, because as many of you will remember, in 1997, before the Kyoto Protocol, before the Kyoto Conference, there was a Byrd-Hagel resolution that was passed in the US, where basically US senators said that they would not let the US take on any legally binding cuts unless developing countries also take on meaningful participation. That's what they called it in those days. Now, you know, whether you agree with that or not, the thing is that that was necessarily a justice argument. They were trying to say that it would be unfair on them if developing countries didn't have emission reduction targets as well. So, I mean, clearly justice is not just something that developing countries ask for and developed countries deny, but it's important to all countries. But in any case, developing country negotiators took a back seat. Southern NGOs tried to push for some fair criteria. Instead of what was, we talk about the Kyoto process as a top-down process, but it wasn't. It was literally a bottom-up process where countries pulled figures out of a hat. So we tried to push for a fair criteria, but in those days, not even many NGOs were willing to talk about equity because they were so afraid that the US would walk away from the table. So if you brought up equity, they would say, no, don't talk about that because that's going to scare the US away. So we ended up with a protocol which effectively dealt with the issue only till 2012, and there was no guidance on what would happen thereafter. Already the people who had been working with the sulfur dioxide emissions regime pointed out that, you know, it was more or less dead because this was a big flaw because we'd be back to square one in 2012 and the next round would have to be renegotiated. And so it was. The Kyoto Protocol may have achieved whatever little it promised, but this was quite insignificant. It was not enough to either make a dent in the emissions or to put enough pressure on developed countries to start investing in renewable energy, to get out of fossil fuels. The US, in any case, walked away after negotiating the protocol to rock bottom. And sadly, you know, in the period that the US wasn't part of the protocol, the EU didn't use that space or that opportunity to try and discuss a future for the protocol that was less ad hoc and arbitrary. Now, as the demands for developing country participation increased, the big developing countries were more and more on the defensive. They thought if we open our mouth, this is a slippery slope. You know, they'd experienced it in other negotiations. They just didn't trust the process sufficiently to engage. So instead of proposing fair triggers for participation and ways of determining fair shares, they chose silence. So they no longer provided the leadership that the LDCs and AOCs used to look to them for. And so these groups, quite understandably, sought alliances with the EU. So you saw what happened in Durban, and what it effectively became a sort of a divide and rule policy because, you know, as many of you will know, the whole basic group was created very much by the UK. You had the Major Economies Forum created by the US, and you had the Durban Alliance was later sort of formalized into the High Ambition Coalition in Paris. And developing countries, I mean, at least in India, I can tell you that they were quite happy to take this on. But what it meant was they wanted to play with the big boys, but they forgot about the poor and vulnerable in India. And so it was that instead of supporting bigger cuts to protect their own poor and vulnerable, they found themselves more and more on the defensive. and in the same category, essentially, as the US, opposing any global determination of country commitments. So the firewall that had been built in Rio and Berlin was slowly destroyed, starting in Bali. And after Copenhagen, you had the INDCs come in. And we were back basically to the pledge and review that the US had wanted in the first place. But the difference here was that the major developing countries were ardently in favor of them. So they supported them. And the twisted logic of where this brought us was, I think, obvious in Paris, where you had the situation where India, which has basically the largest population of poor and vulnerable people in the world, was sort of in opposing the 1.5-degree target, whereas the US was part of the high ambition coalition. And to me, that was, I mean, India was, at least they didn't communicate it very well. They were not, they've always sort of not been very good at, they did try, but what they were trying to say is that if we have a 1.5-degree target, but we don't have a fair way of ascertaining who makes the reductions, then we're going to have to face the pressure. So it was what had happened in Berlin all those many years ago, but this time there wasn't that kind of NGO pressure to make them understand that this is not in your interest. So here we are now in an NDC world. And now, just because countries decide their own contributions, does that mean that, you know, we no longer need equity? Equity is no longer relevant. Justice is no longer relevant. I think, on the contrary, fairness will be more relevant than ever. And this time, not just for developing countries. Because in a post-Paris world, both developed and developing countries will have to justify to their constituencies to show that what they're doing is ambitious and it's also fair. And they're not being asked to shoulder a larger burden than a larger share of the burden. Now, to some extent, the first round of NDCs was the first one. It was it was an easy one. It was a low-hanging fruit. But over time, it's going to get more and more difficult for countries to present NDCs with increased ambition. So while people and governments may not worry too much, you know, about the whole fairness of the situation, but if they think that they're being treated unfairly, then they're going to be very concerned. If they don't have the chance to compare what their NDC is with others before finalizing it, then they're just going to assume that everybody else is going to free ride. So everybody else is going to try to get away with doing as little as possible. And they're going to do exactly the same to avoid taking on unfair share of the burden. They will, you know, if I think that everyone else will be free riding, then the only fair way out for me is to also free ride. And what will this result in? Precisely the same sort of race to the bottom that we're trying to avoid. So what can we do to avoid such a situation? You know, the Paris Agreement talks mainly of aggregate global assessments, although the Global Stocktake, I mean, it's not ruled out. They will be, as I think Christian will talk about later. He's worked with Solisa on this paper. I have a few copies here that we'll pass on, but you'll also be presenting. But there is still the possibility that individual comparisons between countries will take place. In any case, you know, to take equity into account, those individual comparisons will be necessary because moral and ethical considerations are inherently relational. But there are still a couple of challenges that we need to overcome in the current design of the Paris Agreement. First, there's the diverse nature of the NDCs, because different countries have different kinds of NDCs. They even have different time periods, at least for this first period. So any sort of comparison is going to be that much more challenging, if not impossible. Second, there's no fixed point of time when countries are aware of each other's NDC, and they have had an opportunity to have assessments, whether it's done formally or whether it's done by civil society, but to understand what other countries are doing. And then they're expected to all countries, there's an expectation that they will increase their ambition in their NDCs. So, I mean, unless we try to create that, then ambition beyond the minimal sort of backsliding provisions of the Paris Agreement will basically be dead. I mean, you'll get that little movement, but there's not going to be that much enhancements in ambition. So basically, to improve the chances of equity and fairness components in NDCs, you need, first of all, to make sure that they're announced in sufficient time before they are finalized at the national level. So they're indicated, they've not gone through whatever due process they have to go through in countries. There is still the chance to change them. So, and those NDCs are available for civil society, for the Global Stocktake, to make not just a backward-looking stocktake of what's gone by, but also what is going to happen in the future, and to compare that to say whether that's sufficient or not. And then there has to be that period of time when they have that information that they're expected to increase the level of ambition in their NDCs. So the only way to avoid a race to the bottom and ensure the continued support of all countries is to create this process where countries are well informed of what others are doing, have the time they need to assess relative fairness, and then work with each other to create an upward spiral of ambition. So I mean, there's again another paper that there's not enough time to present it here, but we have a proposal to say that, there's a 5-year NDC that countries will be presenting, but they should also be expected to provide an indicative 5-year for the next 5 years, which then becomes part of the whole stocktake process. You can do those kind of assessments. There's sufficient time for countries to go back and to make those changes and then formalize, just before the commitment period starts. Now, we had a side event in Oxford where we were talking about, well, first of all, it wasn't at all about equity, but there was a comment made by one of the architects of the Paris Agreement that one of the main aims of the French presidency was to get out of burden sharing and carbon budgets. And also, in response to a question, it was said that we live in an unfair world. So, there is inequity, and why do we expect that climate change will improve it? Now, we can expect that climate change, we try and sell it as an opportunity for cleaner energy systems, for more resilient development. I think we at least need to see that it will not make inequity worse around the world, because if that happens, it's going to literally be at unsustainable levels. And we're buying this argument because we think, this is what is politically realistic. This is as far as we can go. But I really think that we can change the terms of the debate and how our politicians view the possible and the impossible. The problem right now is that we have a deep-seated discomfort about talking about the elephant in the room. And, even among academics, there was an editorial in a journal recently about how there was, people talking about discussions on justice in both academic work and policy discussions should be avoided because they're conceptually flawed. They could derail the negotiations. They could erode political will. And these people couldn't be more wrong, because actually by avoiding these discussions on fairness and justice, what they're doing is killing any hope of ambition in the future. Any hope that that countries will have the chance to at least build this upward spiral of ambition. So I'll leave it there, and I'm sure that others on the panel are going to get into more detail.
Yeah, thank you, Anju. So that was a brief history of almost 25 years of discussing and avoiding equity discussions. That's a life flashing past me, I think, in some ways. And what I'm hearing from you is actually having a fair equity framework would actually open a safe space for some sort of peer review between countries. Rather than creating a threatening environment, it would create that safe space. And I think that's what I've found fascinating. And someone who has been working on equity frameworks for some time is Sivan Kartha, who is our next speaker. And if you remember, last year, just ahead of Paris, the civil society groups, these SEOs, presented our civil society equity review of the NDCs, or INDCs as they were known now, and which sort of was quite shocking, really, and the gap in both equity, ambition and equity. And I think that's something Sivan will remind of us now. So Sivan is senior scientist at Stockholm Environment Institute and a co-director of the Climate Equity Reference Framework. He has advised and collaborated with diverse organisations, including the UNFCCC Secretariat. He's been a lead author on some of the IPCC work from the Fifth Framework, and is a general expert in equity frameworks and analysis. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Allison. Thanks for inviting me to present on the panel. I will very much join Anju in taking up the challenge of responding to the sentiment. That's a broad sentiment that was expressed by the person who was close to the French presidency, that we live in an unfair world and equity would be nice in theory, but it's just a luxury we can't afford. There's no more time. It'll just jeopardize what progress we've made so far, the progress through to Paris. And wouldn't it just risk dropping us back into these historical debates that are endless and unproductive and divisive even, about equity and what it means. Isn't equity ultimately just subjective? Everybody has their own view. And how do you try and say something meaningful about what would be fair? And I'll take up that challenge by pointing one to kind of an overall structural argument that supports Anju's contention as well, that an agreement that's effective has to be fair. And two, I'll give an example of kind of a model for a discussion, how a discussion about equity could take place, if not among parties, at least within broad groups within civil society. But first, why should we try and assess national efforts on the basis of equity? And our claim is that it's because a global climate response has to be fair if it's going to be effective. Now, why would that be? Well, let's go back to a fundamental truth that we all face. No single country can protect its own climate by reducing its own emissions, because there's no such thing as a national climate. There's a global climate that we all share. And if that's the case, then no country can solve its own climate problem for itself. It inherently is a problem that must be solved in a global cooperative manner. So what that means is that each country faces the challenge of convincing the other countries to help it solve its own climate problem. I need, in the United States, no matter what I do, I could have our own national emissions plummet to zero tomorrow, but I need the Chinas and the EUs and the Indias and a whole range of middle-income countries to also have their emissions reduced seriously. So a country takes action, reducing its own emissions by cooperating in other ways, for example, by providing financial and technological support for the sake of getting other countries to do likewise, so that in aggregate, emissions go down enough to help protect my climate. And a country is more likely to be successful in doing that if other countries perceive it to be doing its fair share. If I'm not doing my fair share, other countries, seeing me as free riding, will decide, even if they're very concerned about climate change, to put their own resources into adaptation to the increasingly likely impacts of climate change. They won't invest first and foremost in helping to protect the rest of the world's climate. And so what that means is that international cooperation with fair effort sharing is just more likely to be agreed. It's more likely to be successfully implemented. It's more likely to be robust. It's more likely to actually hold its form for the long term, which is the time frame over which we'll be solving this problem. And this was echoed in the most recent assessment report of the IPCC, where it concluded in its summary for policymakers, outcomes seen as equitable can lead to more effective cooperation. It's a global commons problem. The only way we can solve it is cooperatively. The only way a cooperative agreement can hold together is if countries are seen to be doing their fair share. So equity is not a luxury that we can no longer afford. Equity is actually a necessity. It's a precondition for an effective regime. We can pretend otherwise. We can continue to muddle through based on entirely nationally determined actions that are motivated first and foremost by fairly short-term national self-interest, but that will not be a 2-degree agreement. And it most certainly will not be a 1.5-degree agreement. So what is a model for trying to have a mature discussion about equity? There was, starting in roughly the first part, spring of 2015, a coalition of civil society organizations that came together to try and have this discussion. The main organizations that were involved are shown here. It was a civil society equity review process, a review of the INDCs that were to be formally announced and agreed in Paris. Ultimately, it was a much, much larger group of organizations that supported and endorsed the results. But one thing you'll notice about the group, the core group that were involved, is that it's a very diverse group. It's a very diverse coalition. There are groups from the north, there are groups from the south, there are groups that are primarily focused on environmental issues, there are groups that are primarily focused on developmental issues. There are groups representing trade unions, group representing farmers and peasants. It's a very broad group. And so one of the first things that this group decided is that they're not going to agree on what equity is. They're not going to agree on what fair shares are. But they can come to a better understanding of each other's perspectives, and maybe together, through a very long, a very careful, a very transparent, and a very respectful process, came to agree that we could at least decide on a range of reasonable expectations for countries' fair shares that we can all live with. And this range, because the group was as broad as it was a fairly broad range. But it was still very informative. So how it was informative was, even though we had a broad range of organizations that had different conceptions of what a given country's fair share would be, we were able to at least bound, with an upper end and a lower end, what countries could be expected to do. And this is shown in this graph. It's a comparison of the fair shares that this group came to the pledges that countries put on the table for a key set of countries. And what you're looking at here are, for each country, 2 green bars representing how many tons of mitigation it should be actively undertaking if it were to do its fair share. And the lower bar represents the range that corresponds to a smaller fair share for that country based on an articulation of the core principles of the Framework Convention, that those who are most responsible should take the strongest action, that those who have the most capability should take the strongest action, but with a weaker definition of what responsibility really means, or what capability really means. And the higher bar would be a stronger definition. And the main dimension along which those 2 key equity foundational principles were measured were as follows. Responsibility, as is typically seen, was seen as your contribution to emissions, your contribution to the problem. How much of the burden of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is due to your own emissions? And there was a range within the group, some saying we should count emissions as far back as we have decent data, which turns out to be about 1850. Pretty much the start of the Industrial Revolution, when fossil fuel emissions started to rise to appreciable amounts. Others said, no, we can't go back that far. We come across problems of national borders changing and problems of consumption by people who are no longer around, but 1950 would be reasonable. Much of the emissions up to that point since that point have gone to the construction of infrastructure that still benefits today's economies. 1950 gets around a lot of the problems having to do with shifting of national borders following World War II and the ending of the colonial era and such. So we'll use 1850 and 1950 as a reasonable range to bound what historical responsibility should be. Similarly, as far as capability, we'll take a range as far as how progressively we should define capability. And when I mean progressive, I mean in the sense that pretty much every country's tax code is progressive. When there are public goods to be paid for or public costs to be borne, every dollar of the poorest person isn't treated the same as the dollar of the richest person. You treat income depending on how wealthy people are. And so looking at national income in the same way and excluding a certain amount as income that's just going toward basic needs or developmental priorities, you can take a more progressive interpretation of income. And so the bounds here, the highest and the lowest, are based on taking a higher, more progressive interpretation of capability, a more deep history version of historical responsibility versus a less progressive version. And progressive here, we're still talking comparable to, say, the US tax code, where there is an exemption, but we're not excluding a large amount of income. It's moderately progressive. There's a third bar for each country here showing the fair share based on interpretations of responsibility and capability that were not seen to be fair. Historic responsibility only going back basically to the drafting of the UNFCCC, 1990. And an interpretation of capability that really is not progressive barely at all. But this was still seen to be a politically salient type of benchmark. It may not be what these groups, their breadth considered, would consider fair, but it is the kind of benchmark that often is discussed. So we have the equity range that our coalition agreed to and a third political benchmark. Now the black lines you'll see on here is a quantification of the INDCs that countries put on the table. How many tons of mitigation their INDC comprises. Very interesting here is even considering a broad range of organizations and even considering a definition of equity that was less progressive and accounted less for historic responsibility than they would consider fair, we still get very clear results when we compare fair shares to the pledges. There are many countries for whom, no matter how you define their fair share, their pledge doesn't come anywhere close. There are other countries for whom, no matter how you can define their fair share, their pledge actually pretty much meets it or exceeds it. And that's an interesting lesson. Another lesson here is that even for this range of definitions of responsibility and capability, for many countries, particularly the more developed ones, United States, EU, fair share, actually, the amount of mitigation they would have to undertake actually exceeds their emissions. Now, does this mean they would have to, in this time frame, make their emissions go to zero and then negative? And similarly, there are other countries, India, Brazil, China, whose fair share actually isn't as high as what would be the transformation that would be needed in their countries to be consistent with a 2-degree or 1.5-degree pathway. And so does that mean we just can't keep to a 1.5-degree pathway if we want to be fair? No, what it means is that in order for the wealthier countries to fully discharge their fair share, in order for the poor countries to actually be on a 2-degree pathway or 1.5-degree pathway, it requires international cooperation. Whereas the wealthy countries that are enabling through financial and technological support more mitigation in developing countries than is actually covered by those developing countries' fair shares. So in conclusion, the key lessons from this experience. One, obviously, we all know countries will have to quite significantly ratchet up their efforts beyond their current pledges to really be at all on a track consistent with the Paris goals. And equity is key if this to happen. As the IPCC said, a fair agreement is more likely to actually work. And what we learned is that through this initiative among a broad range of civil society stakeholders on the basis of science and equity, there are some very clear lessons. First, these initiatives, these discussions can be fruitful, productive learning processes. They need not be divisive. And they can yield informative results. Some nations are unambiguously leaders, and others are unambiguously laggards. For wealthier countries, providing support is actually a core part of being able to fill their fair share of the effort. It's not some additional add-on. It's not something akin to donor countries. This is actually part of them fulfilling their fair share. And for poorer countries, even those who have met their own fair share, much more mitigation work must be undertaken with support through international cooperative action. Much more work beyond their fair share. Thanks, Allison. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Sivan. And I think you've given us a glimmer there. I agree that if that many, how many CSOs signed up to that? That many? 157. Very, very diverse CSOs can come together and make an agreement, at least on the framing of the countries. If they just got on with it, could do it too. I think it's that willingness that we need to push for as much as anything. But that's not the end of it for that CSO equity grouping. We thought, right, we started this job of putting forward the equity framing and the equity framework for our discussions. We actually need to keep continuing to make sure that this equity message is continued. And this year we've decided that what we would focus on is the fact that the work doesn't start in 2020 and then we go to 2030. The work starts now, and we've got the facilitated dialogue this year, which is on pre-2020. So Lidy, who I'll introduce in a second, is going to... Sorry?
I guess there was a reorder. You're fine.
Okay. Sorry, a logistics problem there. So this year on Friday, we're going to launch, and I'll show you it, but then I'll put it away because it's not launched till Friday, is a new mini report, a special report on pre-2020, which Lidy will give us a sort of taster of just to get you excited about it coming out. So Lidy is the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development and coordinator of the global campaign to demand climate justice. She's from the Philippines and she's a member of the Philippines Movement for Climate Justice. Please get us excited about Friday.
I don't know about getting you excited because I can't reveal much of the content, but as Allison was showing you, this is the report that will come out on Friday. So it's really a great report. It's consistent with what we have been doing, which Sivan described, what we did with the CSO equity review of the INDCs. And this time we're applying it for the pre-2020. But before I talk about Friday's events and invite you to come and join us so that you can have your copies and have a discussion around it, I'd just like to add some thoughts on what Sivan has been saying about equity. You know, as people from southern countries, or what is called developing countries in the UNFCCC language, we often find ourselves in a very, very difficult spot when we listen to and participate in the debates here, not just listen to debates among governments, but also participate in debates among civil society. You know? So if we paint kind of like a bipolar picture of the extreme positions, you know, just to illustrate the point of what the extreme positions that are sometimes taken on the question of ambition and equity, you would have groups saying, you know, what's important is to keep temperature rise below 1.5, you know, and equity, if it's just going to get in the way of achieving that, that should be our less priority or least of our concerns. And on the other hand, you would have groups, mostly governments from developing countries, saying that, you know, if we don't have equity in achieving the 1.5, we don't want to accept the 1.5 as a goal, which Anju was explaining as one of the positions in how the negotiations have been coming out. And that was a very interesting historical review, by the way. So we find ourselves, and I was struggling to find what in the English language describes it. So I was Googling it, and it was being between a rock and a hard place. You know, is that right? So it's defined as being between two options that are quite unacceptable. You know, it's unacceptable for us not to keep temperature rise below 1.5, and we're saying this is not because we will survive. We're not surviving now. We're not even reaching 1.5, and already we've had thousands of deaths in the Philippines related to climate change. More than 2 million people displaced in just one extreme weather event. We are not surviving right now. Most of our people are at that risk of losing everything or even losing their lives. So it's not acceptable for us to breach 1.5. But on the other hand, we also agree that it's not acceptable not to do it in an equitable way. And I think just to, again, reiterate what Sivan said, one of the learnings for us is to realize that equity is not just a principle of justice. It's also a very practical necessity, because the mitigation potential is largest in developing countries, in countries of the South. But most countries of the South do not have the financial resources to fully tap into that mitigation potential. There has to be some resources flowing. And if that doesn't happen, we don't keep the goal of keeping it below 1.5. And the third reason why it's, two unacceptable options for us is that, or it's an impossible situation for us, is that if we don't do the mitigation actions necessary in the South, we don't keep the temperature below 1.5. But where are we going to get the resources if the finance doesn't flow? And of course, it's also true that it's not just the financial resources from the developed countries, it's also the need for them to do mitigation at their utmost domestically. So this is not about buying your way out of obligations to do mitigation. So just to emphasize, equity is not just a principle here, it's a practical necessity. The world will not be able to reach that goal of keeping temperature rise below 1.5 if the approach is not acceptable. And then I just want to also emphasize that I think what for us has been very good about the exercise of the INDC equity review of last year, and then again for this review of the pre-2020 targets, is that it provides a framework that first has conceptual clarity. Now for us, it has been very clear what that framework is of equity based on historical responsibility and capacity. It's a very reasonable framework. It's also a framework that has consensus because it takes on various considerations of different groups with different perspectives. It's also a concept that we can consistently apply across all countries. We're not asking for special considerations. We have a concept and criteria that is applied for all countries. And it can be translated into very concrete, quantifiable terms. So that when we talk to our governments, we're not just talking about concepts, we can also talk about it in terms of graphs, in terms of targets, in terms of how we also quantify what does it mean to be fair across the world. And then finally, one thing that's very important for us, for those of us movements coming mainly from movements inside our country struggling to transform our societies, it also provides a way for us to be consistent between our domestic struggles and our international positions. We are struggling to transform, for instance, our energy systems in our countries, moving away from dirty energy. There is no excuse for any government in the developing world for them to keep consistently using fossil fuel. We can talk about transition, just transition. We can talk about phase out, but we cannot talk about avoiding transformation of energy systems from fossil fuel to renewable and democratic energy systems. Anyway, now I'm left with just a few minutes to talk about the pre-2020 launching of the pre-2020 report. It will be on Friday from 2:30 to 3:30. We're going to do it in the press room because we've managed to book a full hour of time for the press room for where the press conferences are held. We'd like to invite everyone to join us. There will be a panel that will explain the content of the report. You know, it was a collective effort across different organizations and endorsed and signed to by even a bigger number of organizations. There will be copies available in hard copy, and then Christian said it will also come out in the website publicly on Friday. So we'd like to invite everyone, and especially those who are going to actively participate in the debate and in the push for equity and more ambitious action. This will certainly help our cause very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Lidy. So what you're saying is equity puts a cushion between that rock and hard place, makes it an easier place to be. I think one of the questions is how do we apply equity in a real practical way to the Paris Agreement? And we've got two presentations left to put that into context and show how these next 2 weeks and the years before 2020 we can put in place good structures and the right measures to ensure equity is well and truly part of that agreement. So I'm going to first go to Christian, and who will talk about the Global Stocktake and the relevance for the Global Stocktake. So Christian Holz is a senior research associate with the Climate Equity Reference Project, which is a project of the Stockholm Environment Institute and Eco-Equity. It is a long-term initiative designed to provide scholarship tools and analysis to advance global climate equity. Basically, he's really clever in this stuff. So please, I'll hand over to you.
Oh, thanks, Allison, for that introduction. So this is more specifically about the global stocktake inside the regime. So much of what we've heard last two presentations was about informal processes outside of the regime that the regime can learn from and that can provide additional input and model certain approaches. But this one is now about the global stocktake in the regime. And as you know, that the global stocktake is one of the few places in the Paris Agreement that explicitly mentions equity as one of its operational principles, and that's quite an important thing. And therefore, it is clearly relevant to this discussion about equity in the post-Paris world. So there is, can you do the honors? All right, and again, no, wait. Yes, that's the one. So there's much to say about the global stocktake beyond the equity dimension. And it turns out when you start thinking about the stocktake, there's lots of interesting things that can be done with that space that the Article 14 opens up. And we covered quite a bit of that in that brief, but not so much equity, that, which is the part that I'm going to focus on here. And I want to talk about some of the possible equity dimensions of the stocktake that could be considered in order to fulfill the mandate in the light of equity that the Article 14 is stipulating. So the main topics that I want to touch upon are the use of differentiation in the stocktake, the issue of the level of aggregation of assessments within the stocktake, making equity itself an explicit topic for the stocktake, and the role of civil society within the context of stocktakes. So the idea here is not to present like fully formed ideas and solutions, but to provide some food for thought on how this, in the light of equity provision, can actually be implemented in the context of developing modalities for the global stocktake. So let me just quickly state how we conceptualize the stocktake in general, just as a very brief intro, I guess. So at the very most basic level, the stocktake will have to consider some sort of benchmark, a state, and the gap. You could think about it that way. So for example, in the case of mitigation, the benchmark could be an emissions pathway or a temperature limitation objective that we have, both of which, I guess, to a degree in the Paris Agreement. And the stocktake would then assess somehow the current state of the collective response relative to that benchmark, and by doing so, identify a gap between the benchmark and the current state. In order to do all that, there is the need to identify and collect appropriate inputs, then go through some sort of a process in order to produce stocktake outcomes. So that's like the basic shape, I guess. And since the stated purpose of the stocktake is to inform the updating and enhancing of action and support, those outcomes should probably be designed in some sort of a way that can assist parties in updating and enhancing their action and support. So it's further also important to remember from Article 14 that the stocktake is mandated to be comprehensive in scope, of course, which at the very minimum would include mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation and support. And for that reason, it seems to be clear that these inputs, processes, and outputs of the stocktake would look different for these different cases. Okay, so I know, right? So with that, we can turn to some of the specific ways in which equity can play a role for the stocktake itself. And one of the most obvious ways, I guess, is the question of differentiation. So the Paris Agreement, of course, has differentiation woven right through it, and in some cases, those provisions are directly relevant for the stocktake. So it seems clear that there will be that differentiation will play a role. For example, in the case of provision of finance, it's clear that some countries are expected to provide finance, while others are encouraged to do so, and others still are not subject to any of those expectations. And as such, the finance component of a stocktake would likely be differentiated by these groups of countries and treat them differently. At the same time, and in the transparency regime, that has, of course, an integral part to play for the stocktake in providing input for it, that the transparency regimes itself is differentiated. And so that will, again, lead to to different levels of differentiation in the input. But also the transparency regime, I guess, is a good example of the unfinished nature of differentiation within the Paris Agreement. It's not quite clear, to quote from the transparency regime article, which countries are those developing countries that need flexibility in light of their capacities, and therefore, because that's currently unclear, differentiation will remain a topic that can even be covered by the stocktake itself, and will play a role in stocktake. Another area where equity can and should be discussed in the context of the stocktake is the level of aggregation of assessment. Some of my colleagues have already referred to that. The text of the agreement doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be globally aggregated. So Article 14, of course, refers to taking stock of collective effort towards the goals of the agreement. And some commentators suggest take that to mean that this can only mean a globally aggregated assessment of efforts. But I don't think, and many of us think that that's not necessarily the case. It's of course true that the concept of individual level assessment has been of adequacy and fairness has been pretty much rejected by parties for the time being anyway. But at the same time, it's quite clear if you look and think about the text of the stocktake that there are some clear signs that at least some elements of the stocktake will have to be disaggregated on a level like lower than globally. For example, as I already mentioned, for a finance component of a stocktake, there would be a group of contributors and a group of recipients, and presumably one question of the stocktake could deal with whether the contributions of the first group meet the needs of the second group, and so you already have a stocktake that is at a level lower than globally aggregated. And likewise, and that's across the pillars, stocktake will have to have some individual level elements. For example, many of the input information that is available on individual level only, right? For example, the NDCs are for individual parties. And at the same time, at the end of the stocktake, the follow-up action, the enhancing and updating of NDCs is on the level of individual parties, which is to say that the parties use the outcomes of the stocktake to update and enhance their actions and support in a nationally determined manner, and that is again on individual level too. Further, the text of "in light of equity" seems to point towards some sort of assessment of ambition and fairness, and it's quite impossible to see, to be honest, how that could work on a globally aggregated level only. So that's not to say that the question of individual level assessment should be reopened. That has been quite decisively decided in Lima and in Paris, that there is currently no appetite for that. But what I'm trying to show you is that there will be inevitably some levels of some elements of the stocktake that are where the stocktake provisions provide for a level of assessments below the global, and that in turn indicates that there is scope to think creatively about what sort of aggregation could be done, perhaps on a basis of groups that could be useful and instructive for parties to when they utilize the outcomes of the stocktake to enhance their ambition. And clearly, a simple global gap assessment is unlikely to provide any useful information that individual parties could apply to their own enhancing and updating. But if, for example, such information would be available on the basis of dynamically defined groups of parties that parties could identify with, they could use that information that comes out of the stocktake to in their domestic application of the multilateral guidance from the stocktake. And finally, and I believe that's an area with a lot of potential in terms of raising ambition and making our collective response to climate change more effective and just. Equity itself could be made a topic of the stocktake. One example, the Stocktake could consider how parties have responded to the request of the Lima call to explain how their contributions are fair and ambitious. And based on that, the CMA could provide further guidance how that that request to explain how it's fair and ambitious can be better implemented in updated and enhanced NDCs. And by the way, this is an element that I think is also very relevant to the 2018 Stocktake, facilitative dialogue, which could be a Stocktake. Because the NDCs under consideration then are the same that the original Lima call referred to, and so it makes a lot of sense that that exercise would look at how parties have explained why their contribution is fair and ambitious. And so and finally, equity could also be made an explicit topic of the Stocktake by examining how parties have dealt with the equity dimensions of climate action within their countries. For example, it could provide a useful, sort of platform for sharing experiences and mutual learnings. For example, how parties have addressed concerns of climate action deepening inequalities within their countries. For example, with regards to income equality, energy access, just transitions, and so on. Or in the case of adaptation, countries could examine and share best practices of how it can be ensured that that adaptation measures actually reduce the climate impact risk of the most vulnerable population, rather than for example, bypassing them. And finally, as we've heard from colleagues, the civil society will continue to conducting its own reviews of parties' pledges of actions and support. And this raises a question how these informal reviews could be useful or could be utilized within the formal Stocktake. For example, the formal Stocktake could provide a way in which the outcomes from those informal processes could be used as inputs. Could think about how the formal process could draw on the lessons learned from the informal ones in terms of what sort of approaches were followed that parties weren't quite ready to utilize in their arguably higher stakes formal processes.
Thank you, Christian. What you've shown is that we can really actually turn what is just a concept within the Paris Agreement into a really practical application, but we need to work in the next few years to make sure it's actually embedded in how they implement. So I think thank you very much for that. And there's one part which has been slightly touched on by a number of speakers, but I think needs a little bit more in-depth, and that is to achieve this, there needs to be a flow of climate finance to make sure that the implementation, that the mitigation potential of many developing countries is actually enhanced and brought forward and delivered. So I'm going to move to Timmons. Timmons Roberts is a professor of environmental studies and sociology in Brown University. He has been researching climate change social science since 1992 and is the author of 12 books, including one, Power in a Warming World, which is about the turn in the negotiations since Copenhagen. Don't we want to forget where Copenhagen moved on? Yeah, but I think that key change that happened up to Paris. His Climate and Development Lab functions as a think tank, providing research capacity to NGOs, delegations, and the UN agencies. So,
thank you, Allison. I'm actually appreciate being invited. I was called by all right, let me go back to Anju's referring to an editorial that we published in Global Environmental Change about 2 weeks ago, called Why Equity is Fundamental to Climate Policy. That was in response to a speech by Robert Cohen, one of the leading political scientists in the world, in a conference in Berlin, in which he talked about how, especially the risk that was described earlier, maybe by that French delegate that Sivan was talking about, namely that equity could be a distraction that might derail the talks. And I think Robert Cohen was especially worried about social scientists focusing on this issue, that we might be getting into some squishy area that it isn't really that important, that what's really important is ambition. And we make the point in that editorial that we need equity in order to have an ambitious outcome, and you've heard the arguments already, so I can skip the whole beginning. But I think it's important, really, our goal in that piece was to really put down a marker and say equity remains important. And I think I would refer you to Anju's recent blog piece on the ECBI site, in which she very strongly argues that equity is not going away and that it's really quite necessary to be dealt with. And I would say that really, if we want an ambitious outcome, it is, in fact, the groups that everybody's afraid of raising these issues actually are the ones who are pushing for greater equity. And I think the civil society review last year showed that the developing countries were doing far more than the developed countries to meet the pledges. Anyway, there's quite a lot to talk about there. So as you just mentioned, Allison, climate finance is kind of the lost piece in the Paris Agreement. There's more to talk about with that. I'll get to some details. But in the agreement, one thing that happened was that the Copenhagen pledge of $100 billion a year was pushed back from 2020 to 2025. And there was really scarce other mention that was in any way concrete and binding. And so I'll get to some details in a minute. Maybe to do Anju one better, I would even push this history back all the way to Stockholm in 1972, in which there was promised an Earth increment. That is, developing countries said, don't take our money for our basic development needs and put it into environmental issues. We need that money for health and schools and roads and agriculture and so on. So the Earth increment issue is still with us. And it was the case in Rio in 1992 when the original Framework Convention was drafted, that there was promises that funding would be new and additional, right? And that language remains very tricky, but extremely important. The developing countries don't want their funding taken from other needs. We did an analysis in a book called Greening Aid, in which we went back and counted 427,000 aid projects to see how many had actually met the Rio promises. And it's different for the different areas of the different treaties there, but for climate change, it was about 4% of the amount that was expected to be needed, according to the Agenda 21, was actually delivered in the next decade. And in Kyoto, I mean, there was some a nice piece that argued that, in fact, developing countries only signed on to the Kyoto Protocol because they thought there was money in it, that there was promises. Atik Rahman made this point, that really they didn't, that deal was made in a green room in the back rooms without the developing countries there, and they only signed on because of the clean development mechanism, which of course we know has not delivered the finance that was expected. And that's the other side of these pledges. Oh, and then we get to Copenhagen, right? The $100 billion a year pledge, which apparently, somebody please tell me if this is wrong, but I've heard was actually a number that was come up with by Hillary Clinton. So as on this very important day in my country, in the US, we all hope that this, that this former Secretary of State is going to win. But she gave us this very strange pledge, and now we have to live with it. And there's good and bad sides to it, right? It's not ever seen that that was adequate. In fact, the expectations and the scientific understanding is that hundreds of billions will be needed, and it will be increasing, and we need to increase this quite quickly. Of course, the Copenhagen Pledge had a lot of wiggle language in it, right? The money could be loans or grants, it could be from private and public funding, and that it was jointly mobilized. And it was a collective pledge. And this is actually very tricky for the issue of equity with collective pledging. That is, how do we keep actors held responsible for meeting their share of the burden? Let's see here. There is sort of a wild west of accounting of climate finance, unfortunately. There's been no baseline. How would we know if we have new and additional funding if there's never been a baseline agreed? There's all kinds of definitions out there from different agencies. Finally, the multilateral development banks are coming up with better definitions. For example, in the case of mitigation, they're using sort of a positive list of what things should be counted as climate finance. I think that's probably necessary. And in the case of adaptation, they're using a 3-step method. That is, you have to identify a vulnerability, describe a project that's going to address it, and then link the two. But in the meantime, we're still using this system called the OECD's Rio markers system, which has grave problems that have been identified by Oxfam. We also did a report through Adaptation Watch last year called Toward Mutual Accountability, in which we found that of the $10 billion that were described as being delivered for adaptation, actually only about 2.3 billion could be described as really rigorously meeting those criteria. So I think this MDB approach is far better, and it'll be much more rigorous. So that's my third point. My fourth point would be we still have a need for adequate, predictable, and justly governed finance after Paris, right? We have this hole in the Paris Agreement that pushed the 100 billion pledge back to 2025. There is this Article 2.1, which is really worth paying attention to, and my colleague Mizan Khan from North-South University in Bangladesh points out that this is seen often as an important part of the Paris Agreement, that is making the financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So, can we, in fact, make the finance flows consistent with what's needed for a green world that is equitable, that helps developing countries? Let's see if there's anything else about that. The Paris Agreement. There's still, I think finance is really the unfinished agenda here, or maybe one of the unfinished agendas. So how are we going to meet these pledges? If you look at the amount of money that's been pledged over the last few years, the roadmap to 2020, even how they're going to get to 100 billion, was released a couple weeks ago from a couple of countries led by the UK and Australia. That document had some better things about it than some descriptions last year, but it still is pretty problematic. I have a blog about that with some details, and I'm about to run out of time, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But I would say the pledges so far have been inadequate. They probably are not going to, realistically, if they're carefully analyzed, scrutinized, they don't really add up to the 100 billion looking ahead a few years. And that could be a part of the pre-2020 review from the civil society organizations. I guess I would sum this up by saying really that pledges have so far been unclear. They're largely inadequate. Their delivery is uncertain. This is the other problem, is we have pledges, but then often we're not sure about the actual allocation of the funding and the delivery of them, on how they're used. So there's really an opportunity, I think, for improving the transparency of the climate finance system, and that's what this year's report is called, Towards Transparency. It's at adaptationwatch.org. We just released this last Thursday, in which we reviewed the biennial reports of the donor countries and found actually the transparency was slipping from 2014 to 2016 reports. So pledges are unclear, they're uncertain, their delivery is uncertain, and they're not transparent. So this all shows, I think, the need for civil society to keep pushing on the need for a real review, an equity review, both on the side of mitigation and on support. So I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Timmons. What we're hearing is there's creative accounting and carbon accounting. There's also creative accounting and financial accounting in the climate finance. And certainly there's not enough money, and it's not delivering the impact we need to see to create that ambition. So we've still got a lot of work to do. And I think I hope what you're hearing from the panel is, yes, equity, actually delivering equity in an equity framework is challenging, but it's essential if we're going to get an ambitious outcome and scaling up. And the other thing is, actually, we shouldn't see it's a scary thing. It's actually, by delivering it, by taking that challenge on, we can create that safe space to talk about ambition, to talk about scaling up. So it's something that's essential, and it's something that can actually open the discussion much, much further. talking about opening the discussion, I think we've talked enough. We've only got about 15, maybe 20 minutes if we push our time frame. But I would like to open for short comments and questions from the floor. I'll take 2 or 3 at a time, and please say who you are and where you're from when you make your comment. Can anyone volunteer? We've got a volunteer, great, to take the mic around. So do wait for the microphone. So please, show of hands for those who want to come in. Go on. Yep. Okay, we've got 2 now. We've got one at the front there and one right in the middle here, the gentleman there. So please.
I'm Mizan Khan from Bangladesh, a party to this conference. Thank you. I know some of the panelists very closely, and especially Timmons has been working on climate finance for long years, especially on transparency. I'm absolutely confident that there is a discussion that we are already living in a post-equity world, but that is not the case. If you look at the Paris Agreement, almost all the articles have got some kind of differentiation. Only the difference with the convention and the Paris Agreement is we have this differentiation and equity in a kind of attenuated form, not exactly as it was in the convention, just dichotomous distinction. That is not there. But we have clear-cut differentiation. This is one thing. So it's not going to die. For the sake of a universal agreement, developing countries, especially major emitters from developing countries, have agreed kind of a temporary truce, what we can say, but it is likely to come up. In terms of finance, for example, Paris Agreement is no better than its parent, the convention, but there are only 2 silver linings that I think in the Paris Agreement. As Timmons has mentioned, the finance was linked to the 2-degree centigrade. That is a positive thing, as well as adaptation was regarded as a kind of function of mitigation. So these are the 2 things. Absolute goal of adaptation is very vague. I don't have much confidence in that, but that is very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll take a couple more, but there's certainly this gentleman in the middle.
Thanks. My name is Mikel Lejean, and I'm here with Corporate Accountability International. And I think just referencing more, taking a step back and looking at the entire UN, equity is one of the basis for creating a more just world. And I think that the points around equity are valid and ring true if we are looking at one of the biggest moments in changing the entire system of the world. Climate change is set to do that. And if we're not establishing equity as baselines in every framing and in every policy here, there are no precedent-setting measures that can be linked elsewhere on as large of a scale as this one. So definitely agreeing with the points of equity being major parts, and also the financing and adaptation pieces as being essential components of that as we look towards mitigating the risks of a 1.5 degree breach.
Thank you. I think both our comments there, seeing that silver lining, seeing that positive move, sort of creating a positive momentum here. Are there any questions to the panelists? I'm intrigued. I mean, there's one here, and I might have one also.
Hi, Manaswini from the OECD. This is regarding the civil society review. I'm very curious as to see what the reaction from certain governments was following the release of the review, and if you're aware if some of them approach negotiations differently following the release of this review. Thanks.
Actually, that was very similar to the question I had. I was talking to one of the UK negotiators last week, saying that this new report was coming out, and he said, "Oh, that's the report that tells the US they've got to do 200% of their emissions reduction in one go." You know, sort of very, very dry. So I did come back and say, no, it's about the ambition gap. It's about doing more. It's about urgency, and that's what. But I'd be interested to hear, particularly those involved in the equity review, how you felt the responses from the governments last year came. So maybe we'll open the panel to that discussion.
Yeah.
yes, how different, yes, how the developed and the developing countries maybe responded differently. So yeah, we'll start with Christian and no, you want Sivan and then Lidy if you come on that.
There was keen interest and anxious interest to its release from some. I think on the part of many developing countries, it was seen as mixed in the following sense. It was received very gratefully in the sense that it validated a lot of what they had been saying about equity and what the implications are as far as how much different countries really need to be taking responsibility for. It was held up by chair of the G77 at the time, Ambassador Diseko from South Africa, and referred to her several times as an important example of an effort that kind of laid equity bare, in a sense, made it a process and an initiative on which ambition could be built. I say mixed because there was also another piece of our results that was inextricably tied to that, which is that while developing countries' pledges may have met their own fair share, the climate problem itself has put them in a position where they have to do much more than their fair share, which simultaneously makes them sort of, braces them for what more must come if we're to keep to a 2-degree pathway, but also arms them with further arguments for why the financial and technological support is as important as it is, and why its predictability and reliability and additionality is as important as it is. We need real support in order to actually help the world meet these targets. On the side of the North, there was much less said publicly. I have reason to believe there was a lot said privately. And whether it has changed any negotiating positions on the North, I guess in part we'll see during this COP.
Lidy, did you want to come in on that, the response?
Well, as Sivan was saying, the responses from developing country governments were most positive, but also quite a bit mixed. I guess it really depends on the assessment, our assessment of what the fair share of the developing country was and what their actual pledges were. For the most part, the assessment was that most of the developing countries were approximating their fair share, but there are different types of NDCs from developing countries. Like from the Philippines, for instance, it is a challenge. It was a challenge because the Philippines NDC was a 70% all conditional on funding. So we also used the report as a challenge to our government that there should be some measure of unconditional targets that doesn't depend on external funding. This continues to be a debate and a discussion and engagement that we have with the Philippine government because there are also those thinking that perhaps we should not even be having any mitigation pledges. So I guess in short, I'm saying for us, it's very useful because the report is able to, we are able to use the report to have a interesting, difficult, but nevertheless productive engagement with our governments in working out what developing country governments should be doing about climate action.
Do we have any other questions from the floor? Yep, we have two more there. We'll start with the lady here and then we'll go to the gentleman. I'm pleased to hear you are.
Okay. This is Lee. I'm a university professor from National Central University of Taiwan. I have a very brief question on this conclusion that no baseline. Are we talking on no clear definition? Is this true? I mean, even in terms of the development aids, or is it something special in the climate change regime that I remember that we have like adaptation funds, we have green climate funds, and we have like funds for the least developed, and we got all sorts of the quote unquote financial mechanism. Yet without baseline information, there's no way to distinguish the new and additional money. And also another quick comments on that 100 billion. Yes, that was coming from Hillary. And then there was like fast start money. And then afterwards, this 100 billion money every year. Yeah, thank you.
We'll take the other question and then we'll, so we had a gentleman across. Yes. Here.
Hi, and thanks very much. My name is Neil Craik. I'm from the University of Waterloo. I think my question is probably for Sivan, and it's really a question around the methodology of your report. And I'm just trying to understand how you got to those numbers and whether you were using, is it really a carbon budget exercise in an allocation up to 2030 that you're using? Or is it some other methodology? And I guess my follow-up question is, were you accounting for non-CO2 greenhouse gases and other climate forcers? And were you accounting, and how do you account for land use changes within that framework as well? Because we're doing a similar project, so I'm quite interested in some of these methodological questions that I'm sure you grappled with.
That's something we grappled with a lot last year, isn't it? But we'll start with Timmons and the finance question.
So on foreign assistance, there are definitions agreed by the OECD's, Donor Assistance Committee, the DAC, and these were mentioned this morning in the workshop, actually on in session workshop on climate finance accounting modalities. But the point there, this was actually raised by an OECD official saying we have some definitions that we've used in the past. For example, for it to be called foreign assistance, a loan has to be at a certain level of what's the word? Concessionality. Thank you. That is that it's below market rates, right? That countries are receiving the funding with a little bit of a subsidy. So there are some rules in the the OECD accounting system, but there have not really been in climate finance. This has all been donor driven. That is the developed countries have defined what they count and what they report. Some have reported things that others would never report. Some reported, for example, Japan reporting coal-fired power plants in Asia. The U.S. counting originally during the Fast Start period export credits, which are, of course, funding American corporations, that is providing them with insurance, which other countries had not done before that point. In other words, it's not been very balanced. It's not been really decision-making under the UNFCCC of what should be in the categories. And then there's the actual definitions of what counts. That is, what is adaptation and what is mitigation? Should we count everything? Should it be, for example, one of the big problems, and I don't blame the OECD at all for this, really, it's a problem with the reporting coming up from the countries, that countries are using the Rio marker system in very different ways. We have a whole table in this year's report that describes, it's largely from the OECD CPI report last year, showing just how different countries adjust the numbers. If, for example, a project is called adaptation, even though it's maybe a very small portion of a much larger project, they'll often count that whole amount. Some of them will count 100%, some will count as little as 1% or 5 or 10%. So it's all over the place. And on the baseline question, we've reviewed some of the, a piece that we wrote in 2011 about the lack of a baseline for the Copenhagen pledges. And in fact, we're still in that situation today. So anyway, that's got to be resolved. It would be sort of like having pledges for mitigation without any baseline. So the US saying we're going to reduce our emissions by 26 to 28%, but not saying if that was over 1850 levels or 2005 levels or something. So I'm being a little extreme, but That is, you need a specified baseline.
Could I just follow that up slightly, because the OECD by its nature is the developed, the donor country analysis, and the developing countries feel they need their say. I wonder if there's any thought on how we might progress that element of transparency with more developing country input.
Well, I hope there's going to be progress in this SBSTA accounting finance modalities discussion that's going on right now. It has a deadline of, officially CMA1, which was expected to be, down the road, but it's happening now. Maybe in the next year or two, there will be some better system for, guidelines. What is it? MPG, procedures and, modalities, procedures, and guidelines for reporting this stuff. So I think there's an opportunity right now, and there's of course much better information systems that could be adopted, and these multilateral development banks are doing better, and if developing countries find this adequate, and that's a big if, then maybe we're going somewhere. But there needs to be this discussion under the UNFCCC, I think. Again, this just won't go away. It's not going to go away unless we really deal with this as one of the equity issues. Again, as I think Sivan said, finance is just one of the parts of international cooperation is part of equity from the very beginning.
Thank you. Simon, we'll move to the technical questions that you got there, and then we'll do a final wrap up of this.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Neil. There is a lot to be said about the methodology, but the one main thing to say is that the objective from the start was to make it a fruitful, deliberative, trust-building process that didn't get bogged down in the analytical details. And so the methodology itself is, I like to think, as Einstein exhorted us, as simple as possible and no simpler. And so we take basically from off-the-shelf sources of information, like the UNEP emissions gap report, for example, the total amount of mitigation that's needed for the year 2030. The whole thing was benchmarked to 2030. Total amount, some 18 gigatons, and divide that among countries proportional to their share of the global responsibility and their share of the global capability, where those two things are defined in, again, as simple a way as possible. Historic emissions in some particular base year, and total national income reckoned relative to some threshold to make it progressive. As far as the particular question you asked about non-CO2 and land use, those two, for historical emissions, we took those off of standard international databases, Global Carbon Project and US EPA non-CO2 database. And so, as much as possible, we just tried to go with things that everyone had access to. In fact, I think in all cases, everyone had access to it. They were well vetted, widely used, that sort of thing. But I'm more than happy to talk to you more about it afterwards.
Thank you, Sivan. Yes, and there is a full write-up and the links that are in the report that you can look at further. I wondered if any of the speakers felt there was something else needed answered. I think we have covered quite comprehensively the issues, and I hope you've gone away with a very positive attitude towards the role of equity in these negotiations. We started with this long history of the equity discussions, and I think the journey is still continuing, most definitely, to make sure that it's at the heart of Paris, that it's accepted and it's seen as this safe place rather than the scary place. So we'll invite you along again. We're launching this new report on pre-2020 ambition and equity on Friday morning. At what time? Afternoon. 2:30 to 3:30 in the press conference room. Do come and hear more about that, and the call for urgency for action, not to wait until 2020. And I'd like to thank all our speakers. It's been really enlightening, and thank you for being with us and listening and participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
it is like